he has got, everything has gone wrong in his life. First of all, he doesn't get along with his brothers. Then his brothers sell him into slavery. And then the people that bought him take him to Egypt and they sell him into slavery. And not only do they sell him into slavery, they sell him to the captain of the guard. This guy was a very brutal man. His name was Potiphar. And he was the captain of the guard, or the bodyguard, if you will, for Pharaoh. And they had charge of the jails, and they were pretty much the henchmen. They were the enforcers, if you will, for Pharaoh. And then Potiphar's wife decides that she wants to have a fling with Joseph, and that doesn't go. Joseph stands his ground and says no. You know, he wanted to be obedient to the Lord. And he said absolutely not. And so she says that, oh, he tried to rape me, and, you know, yada, 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 and look at, he left his coat, she grabbed his coat. And so she basically told a lie about him. He gets thrown in jail for it, and while he is in jail now, it's been a while, we pick up with what happens in chapter 40 of Genesis. And before we get into that, it's just one of those times in Joseph's life where it just seems like he takes a step forward, and then all of a sudden he takes 2 steps back. Ever have those kind of experiences in your life? Shake your head north to south. You do things, and then all of a sudden something happens out of nowhere, and you get broadsided, and it's like, what? Why did this happen? Things were going along so well, and then all of a sudden, life just seems to take a turn for the worse. Genesis chapter 40. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. That was the Pharaoh. Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the 2 men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected, so he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine there were 3 branches, and as soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given him a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket of my head." "Well, this is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Yum. Sounds like a sandwich to me, doesn't it? He's a baker. Never mind. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that once again he put the cup into the Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. It's kind of a birthday present. And the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot it. All right. Here's what this story says. We're not going to concentrate on the dreams because the dreams really aren't the story here. Within your day as a Christian, you're going to encounter conflict and challenges and divine appointments. That just seems to happen every day. You're going to see conflicts, you're going to see challenges, and you're going to see divine appointments. And sometimes those things happen because of the circumstances surrounding your life. Sometimes even those circumstances that don't seem fair or right. But even when those circumstances happen, the things that don't seem fair and don't seem right, sometimes those conflicts and those challenges and those divine appointments are part of a greater plan that God has in store for you. This was certainly the case with Joseph. This is just an incident, if you will, a chapter in Joseph's life. But something happens in this that has an effect for later on in Joseph's life. But Joseph didn't see it at the time. Things happen in your life on a daily basis that don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But sometimes God is up to something that will have an impact later on in your life. And so I want us to take a look at what these things are and how God uses some of these incidents and then leads you by His Spirit according to His purpose and His plan. You've heard the saying that God is not interested in your ability but your availability. And so there's this idea that you need to be able and available to God. You know, you should be able and available to God. And that sounds good, but you see, it's not exactly right. God knows your ability, which includes your experiences in life. And He wants to use those for His purposes. So He's looking for your ability and your availability. So it's not just your ability that He's looking for, and it's not just your availability. He's looking for both. If you will define ability as those circumstances, those experiences, those things that you've learned in life, those things that you have gone through in life that become part of you, part of your ability. God is looking for those things as well as your availability. I can't even say it, but you know what I'm trying to say. Now, some of you are probably thinking, I thought you said that God uses and works through our weaknesses, and absolutely He does. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 through 10 says it this way. But He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And what Paul was saying here was, look, it's when I am not able to do those things that I feel should be done, that God's strength is most evident and most powerful in my life. But the secret here is that God is revealed through your weaknesses. Now hold on to that thought. God is revealed through your weaknesses. He may choose to use your strength and abilities, but it will be during a time of conflict in your life. Think about that. God may choose to use your strengths and your abilities, but it will be during a time of conflict in your life. A time of challenge, when you don't have it all together, when your circumstances have debilitated you, when you are weak. So your ability is actually something that God will use, but He will use it during a time of weakness in your life. Now you may think that you're like this really strong person, strong-willed. You know, I've got it all together. I'm kind of unflappable. I don't let circumstances get me down. I can see beyond it, and so forth and so on. But then all of a sudden something comes along and devastates you, and God says, look, I'm going to use your ability to be strong-willed and to be organized and to be focused and everything in this time of weakness in your life. So it is a time of weakness where God is going to shine through. God uses your ability and your availability in times of conflict. He wants your ability and He wants your availability. And He wants it when you find yourself in those times of challenges and weaknesses in your life. So when you find yourself in those times of conflict or of challenge, there are three things that we can learn from Joseph. The first thing that we can learn is don't put timelines on God. Don't put timelines on God. Genesis 40, verse 1. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt, and they got thrown in jail. Now, see, here's something that you and Joseph have a lot in common. You haven't figured out God's timing. You've tried, but you have not figured out God's timing, have you? And you wondered, God, why do you let things happen the way they happen when they happen? And you've even argued with God about some of those things, about God's timeline. You and Joseph have not figured out God's timeline. This happened sometime later. What does that mean? Weeks, months, years? We don't know. It happened when God was ready to use Joseph. That's when it happened. Now, as frustrating as that may seem, I want you to see some things about this. First of all, God's timing is perfect. God's timing is perfect. He didn't throw the cupbearer. The cupbearer was a guy who was basically the butler. That's the best way to think of him. He didn't throw the butler and the baker in jail, years before when Joseph wasn't there or when Joseph hadn't risen to prominence in running the jail. He didn't do it then. He didn't wait for years and years and years later. The timing was perfect. God's timing was perfect. And so we need to understand that even though we don't know what God's timelines are, what His timelines are, His trains always run on time. God's timing is perfect. Everything that happens to Joseph is preparing him for the next chapter. the next chapter of his life. Everything that has happened in Joseph's life, as we've studied Joseph's life, everything that seems to happen affects the next thing that's going to happen in his life. And then the next thing, he makes his brothers mad. And so they throw him in the pit, and then they sell him to somebody. And then the next thing, that affects the next thing. They sell him, they take him to Egypt. Then they sell him to Potiphar. And then Potiphar, he becomes the head of the household in Potiphar's household. And so his wife takes a life. Everything that happens, even though it seems to be setting Joseph back every time, everything that happens affects the next thing that's going to happen to Joseph. Now, you may say that, well, so what? That's simple. That's exactly what's happening in your life. The things that are going on in your life, those circumstances and those weaknesses in your life, those are things that God is working at in your life as He prepares you for the next thing that He's going to do in and through your life. God is in the business of preparing you for eternity. And so everything that happens sets you up for the next thing that God wants to accomplish as He prepares you for eternity. Everything that happened to Joseph was preparing him for the next chapter. Not that everything was God's will, by the way. Everything that happens in your life isn't God's will. You've heard me say that everything that happens in your life is either engineered or allowed by God. Some things God does engineer in your life. Some things He allows and then He just uses. He uses those things here, not that it's His will. When I was a boy, I was hit by a drunk driver. I don't think it was God's will that I get hit by a drunk driver. I don't think God wrote down a time line and said, hey Gabe, back when he's 11 years old, you make sure a car runs over him and make sure it's a drunk driver. You know. God doesn't do that. That wasn't God's will, but God used that somehow or other in my life. He used that to accomplish something that He wanted to accomplish in and through my life. Everything that happened to Joseph was preparing him for the next chapter. He was his father's favorite. That led to his brother's jealousy. His brothers sold him into slavery. They sold him to Egypt, sold him and on and on and on and on. And now Potiphar throws him into jail. He's in jail where he takes over the management of the jail. But then, look what happens. Look who shows up in Joseph's life again. Genesis 40, verses 2 through 4. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Who was the captain of the guard? Potiphar. Potiphar was the captain of the guard. There's a different word for jail keeper. That word is used earlier in the passage. But the captain of the guard was Potiphar. Potiphar knew that Joseph was there. And he knew that he could put these two guys under Joseph's watch care, and that Joseph would make sure that they were kept in line, that they were taken care of appropriately. Not that he wanted benefits for them, he just wanted to make sure that things went according to plan. We don't know why they were in jail. We don't know what they tried to do. But for some reason or other, Potiphar felt like they needed some extra attention and needed some extra discipline or extra control. So he puts them under Joseph's watch care. Now, that was something that God was doing. Potiphar didn't know that God was using him for that. That was just something God did. He used Potiphar to put these two guys under Joseph's watch care so that he could accomplish something. Everything that seemed to be bad news for Joseph, God used to advance His purposes. Think about that in your life. Everything that seems to be bad news in your life, God can use to advance His purposes. He did it in Joseph's life. Why can't He do it in your life? Why won't He do it in your life? The answer is, He does. When you begin to see and understand that God is preparing you for the next chapter of your life, then you begin to understand God is up to something. That God can use the difficult times in your life to prepare you for what He wants to accomplish. And it all happened according to God's timing. Don't put timelines on God.